Let's talk about this iceberg that we're heading towards, as you say it, while we're contemplating what's on the menu. You've said that this is the first time in modern history that we're seeing stocks, sovereign debt, and fiat currencies all in crisis at once, and that's the difference this time. So explain what you mean by that, and explain how this convergence of these three pillars crumbling at once plays out and what that could look like.
Yeah, and again, I joke it's the Piepenburg broken record. I always start with debt because I think you can't overstate debt enough. And once you understand just the basic concepts of these debt and the basic math, and it doesn't require a lot more facts, whatever strand you pull on, whether it's currencies, whether it's bond markets, even whether it's foreign policy, and certainly whether it's monetary policy, all of this in the bond market and the stock market, everything does come from the credit market, which is the debt market. So all of these things are connected. All this is verbunden. It's all connected. And again, I go back to these simple things. The day of my birth in the 70s, U.S. debt was 200. Public debt, government debt was 246 billion. And where I am today in my lifetime, we're now at 37 trillion. And that's appalling. And a billion versus a trillion isn't just mathematical and isn't just alphabetical, it's mathematical. As John Rubino reminded me a month or two ago, a billion seconds ago was somewhere around 1997, but a trillion seconds ago was 30,000 BC. So these trillions matter. They're not just abstract numbers you throw out to show what you can memorize. And, global debt, it's not just a US problem. Global debt in 1997, when I started my first hedge fund, was at 30 trillion. And now it's at 300 trillion. That's a hockey puck. It's a rocket ship up and to the right in just the last 25 years. So these aren't things I'm just making up. They're real. And it's not just at the market level or the government level that debt is extreme. Household debt is now 97% debt to income. And so, these are the numbers. And in case you think there's no evidence of how those things break things, you don't have to go back a century. You don't have to go back to FDR. You don't have to go back to 1929. Just in the last 6 to 7 years, it started, and I thought it was completely ignored by the mainstream media and the financial consensus RIA industrial complex. But the 2019 repo crisis was a disaster. It was a credit crisis. It was because of a debt crisis. And just a year later in March, during the COVID hysteria, that was also not a COVID-induced 2020 market plunge. That was a bond market-induced market plunge in 2020 because bonds and stocks fell together in 2020. And just 2 years later, across the pond in the UK, we had the gilt crisis. That was sovereign UK bonds being unloved, undesired, and yield spiking and the cost of debt skyrocketing. The next year in the US, we've already forgotten the headlines. You and I talked about it years back. We had that banking crisis in 2023. 4 of the 5 largest bank failures in U.S. history, forgotten. But that too was not a banking crisis. That was a credit crisis. It was a bond crisis. It was the U.S. treasuries that were the underlying collateral on those banks. And then you fast forward to just this year, Liberation Day, the tariff, event, markets losing 10 trillion and then recovering when Trump did the two-step. But that wasn't a tariff crisis. That was a U.S. Treasury debt crisis because right after Liberation Day, there were crickets at the U.S. Treasury auctions and massive sell-offs by U.S. owners of U.S. Treasuries, not just Japan and China. So those were all examples of a credit crisis, a debt crisis, and a bond crisis. And they were showing us in real time that we're over our skis in debt. And again, it's not just me finding the evidence. The evidence is all around if you're willing to look for it. And in this debt crisis, we have very few options. We can default, which we won't do. So we'll have to inflate away our debt. And the way we do that is dishonest. Inflating away debt just means you have to have an inflation rate higher than your yield on your 10-year, and so you have negative real rates. That's the fancy term. You just have to inflate away your debt. You debase your currency to do that. But the way we do that so dishonestly and disingenuously is we lie about the inflation rate. We just do. The BLS is a fiction source, not an honest math source. And the CPI scale used to measure that inflation scale has been, changed 22 times since 1980. It's probably closer to 10%. So we're running negative real rates. We're running a debased currency policy. We're running an invisible tax on the people, lower, middle to upper class, to basically pay our debt by debasing the dollar, as von Mises, as David Hume, as even Ernest Hemingway warned, who weren't, all in the same generation. This is Ima Vida das Gleiche, or always the same. And I think this debt this debt is so powerful that as we talk about stablecoins, or we talk about the markets, or we talk about tariffs, or any of these topics that are making current headlines, they're as old as history itself. We're in a desperate state because we're running out of options. And when you get to a debt to GDP level at World War II levels with no war, the emergency isn't war. The emergency is our own overspending and the mismanagement and criminal negligence of our monetary policymakers and our leadership, left or right, because all of these nations and all of these policies and all of these parties, whether it's Democrat or Republican, to me are just two stirrups to the same saddle. They spend more than they can to get short-term dopamine rush for political reasons, not for longer-term thinking.
Okay, a lot to unpack there, but let's begin with, you mentioned the tariffs and you mentioned President Trump, and say what you will about him. He's trying new tactics. He's playing the long game here. And arguably, many would say for the greater good of the country. He's using those aggressive tariffs to rebalance in the US's favor, but not just as leverage, but as a tool to bring back supply chains, to rebuild US industry, make America less dependent on adversaries. Now, we have already seen several trade deals signed successfully. I believe there's over $2 trillion in foreign investment pledged from countries like Japan, the EU, South Korea. There's been $150 billion already collected in tariff revenue. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent projecting more, at least $300 billion by year end. I mean, just the other day, even Apple, arguably the poster child for cheaper labor and global supply chains, is now pledging another $100 billion in U.S. manufacturing, bringing its total to $600 billion. Now, granted, this is to secure exemptions from the new chip tariffs, but it's working. I mean, the goal for the Trump administration is to rebuild American industry, protect national security, regain economic sovereignty, build back the fundamentals of the American economy. Could Trump's strategy, onshoring manufacturing, taxing imports, reshoring supply chains, could that change things? Could that buy more time? Could this delay the systemic reckoning? Could it even prevent the systemic reckoning that you speak of?
Look, let's be very clear. We have to look at tariffs from the positive and the negative. What you've just listed is a very compelling list of positive things, many of which I agree with. One of the reasons I was supportive of Trump was his larger plan of reshoring American labor, reshoring American jobs. Again, I'm from the Midwest. I've seen the Rust Belt. I've seen what offshoring the American dream to China with the World Trade Organization in 2001 under Clinton. That wasn't really China becoming a bigger market for our blue jeans and things. It was China basically making our blue jeans and things. That was a misreported kind of new world. And as I've said many times, the American dream is now made in China. So the idea of reshoring manufacturing, putting on tariffs in some strategic way to convince mostly American CEOs to bring labor back to America is absolutely something I agree with. And there's absolutely no denial, whether you're left or right, that whatever you think of Trump, love or hate, or whatever you think of Biden, love or hate, there's certainly more activity in the current administration than there was under Sleepy Joe. That some people take offense to that. Is that activity bold? Is it intelligent? Is it audacious? Or is it stupid? It depends on people's politics, what they think. I think when we answer the question about tariffs, are they good or bad? Are they inflationary or deflationary? Are they fair? Are they effective? Are they legal? And do they even work? You've got to try and step away from a red or blue lens. And again, look at both sides of the argument. And there's a lot to be said to your point. This is a necessary measure, not a desperate measure, a necessary measure to solve an age-old problem from 2001, to bring the P back into GDP, bring manufacturing back to America. I completely applaud that. The question is it going to work? Is it effective? Is the External Revenue Service incoming revenue offsetting the loss in GDP? How do we predict and make a prognosis on that? The most obvious bear case on this, or the negative case, is we've seen this for the last couple of months, people talking, of course, about Smoot-Hawley. That tariff act came at the top of a market bubble heading into a recession. It didn't end well for the Senate careers of Smoot and Hawley, and it really didn't end well for McKinley, the president who put those tariffs on, that it was an absolute disaster. Here in Europe, if you read the German press or the French press, or you listen to the economists here, they think this reshoring will take decades, years, whether it's pharma, aluminum, steel, whether it's wood, whether it's intermediary parts. That's their perspective. So even though if you're applauding the nobility of taking the first steps, it won't be solved in the near term for Trump, which maybe he's thinking long beyond his legacy, and that's fantastic. That again is, I think, to be determined. There's also the inflationary or deflationary debate about tariffs and which is better or worse in the short term pain that Bissett and Trump talk about for long term gain. Hypothetically, a 15% tariff pretty much means a 15% price hike. So it means inflation in certain goods. And as many economists will say, inflation creates its own deflation because as prices go up too high because of these protective tariffs, that creates its own deflation because demand falls. And so you get deflation. And you can debate that for hours, and many have. And we'll see. And that maybe sounds like a cop-out question, but it hasn't really progressed enough to see whether it's inflationary or deflationary until it really gets into full gear. And then there's also the question of fairness. The anti-Trump camp, and certainly in Europe, where I spend most of my time now, they think it's unfair. A Trump 15% tariff or a 30% tariff or negotiating tariff or a 40% tariff. It depends on the good, whether it's pharma, whether it's aluminum, whether it's steel, whether it's a different asset or a different product. But this kind of negotiation by chaos and these tariffs seem unfair. But I think it's important to remind European listeners as well that the VAT tax, the value added tax that Europe puts on American products is 20%. It's not a tariff in form or in substance, but it is in form, but it really is in substance. And let's also not forget that China built its entire auto sector behind a 25% tariff wall when Japan's tariffs were at 0 and the US was at 2.5% and the EU was at 10. So it's not like Trump is the only bully here playing, for national interest. All nations are self-interested, and all nations have used protective tariffs, or you could say weaponized tariffs in the past to build their own demand inside their own borders. So, you can take both sides of this. The real question, to your point, is this effective?
Right.
Will this be effective? And, a Yale professor was just on the other day talking about this. I've seen studies out of Zurich that are very convincing with their models that tariffs, will take at least a percentage point off our GDP near term, for the next few years, versus the revenues we're bringing in on the External Revenue Service on these tariff deals. We're going to lose growth because despite the long-term play, the long-term gain, the costs and the deficit spending and the production costs and the wage labor effects are going to be very expensive. That's going to hurt our growth. We really can't grow until we get out of debt, and we're trying to grow first without getting rid of that cannonball of debt. That's the key part. That's what Luke Gromen and I agree on. You can't fix this. You can't even have these policies until we solve the spending and the debt side of it first. So there's the argument that despite the revenues coming in, the flip side of the growth loss, that too is too early to determine. It's academic and theoretical right now. But we saw what happened on Liberation Day with those tariffs. And that obviously, to me, what that said was when Trump was threatening massive tariffs, like 100% tariffs on China, that was a road too far, a bridge too far. And he had to two-step back on that because demand for U.S. Treasuries really tanked on that type of announcement. The August tariffs, those were more foreseen and baked in. So there's still, in Europe, they talk about there's no legal measures in place. There's no even idea how these are going to be papered. And there's a sense that we don't even know how long they're going to last. And a big argument made in Europe, not saying it's right or wrong, it's just important for all of us to look at different sides. Are these tariffs even legal? They're happening, but they're not under investigation. They're being challenged by 11 different courts right now because Article 1, Section 8 says this is the domain of Congress. So where is Congress in all of these executive orders? In Europe, people are wondering, and in Asia, how long will these executive orders last? How long will they be enforceable? Where is the Congress in this? And there is something either entertaining, horrific, or noble about this type of president who can do these type of executive actions almost to some like a monarch rather than a democratically elected president. Again, that's for each of us to decide for ourselves. But to answer your question, Michelle, it's too soon to tell whether GDP will be offset enough by incoming revenues to solve the problem. My view is, as I said from the very beginning, when you're at 120% debt to GDP, when you're at 37 trillion, when your deficit of spending versus tax receipts went from 1 million to now 2 million this year, these things are effective, the hundreds of billions, the 50 billions. But I hate to say it. And again, I'd say this to a Democrat or Republican, they're a guppy solution to a whale of a debt problem. And to me, going back to my original point, love it or hate it, I think these are desperate acts. It's certainly better than doing nothing. But we are at a point where, again, the Wizard of Oz isn't going to solve this. We're going to have to go through some austerity, some constructive destruction, some mean reversion in the markets if we're really going to admit to ourselves, like we would in a family or a business, that we've spent more than we earn. We're going to have to tighten our belts. We're going to have austerity. We're going to have to cut spending. And where are we going to have to cut spending? The places where the debt to GDP would only be solved is in entitlements and military. And I don't see that happening. So this is where it really becomes a real paradox, regardless of where the S&P is or regardless of what the headlines are. That 37 trillion, that 120% debt to GDP, that bond market being unloved and that de-dollarization that isn't a conspiracy theory is all happening at the same time. That as the debt keeps rising, the bonds keep falling. We're in this desperate phase right now. It doesn't mean the end of the world. It doesn't mean the end of the dollar. But I don't see these as being long-term solutions right now.
All right. On the de-dollarization point, I do want to touch on stable coins, which may create a new market for treasuries. But before we unpack that, let's focus on the measure that we mentioned at the top of the show, which could fall under what you would call a desperate measure, or perhaps a nuclear button, or perhaps exactly what's needed that maybe could save everything. And that's this gold revaluation. Now, you've long suggested that the U.S. could revalue gold. That idea seems to be gaining traction. As I mentioned, we have a note from the Federal Reserve discussing it. Now, this could just be planting the seed, just putting that idea out there. But the Federal Reserve effectively just cracked open the gold revaluation playbook. In that note, the Fed outlines how countries like Germany, Italy, South Africa, and Lebanon tapped gold gains to raise cash without selling a single ounce of gold. And that Fed note reads, with public debt at high levels, so they're acknowledging that, some governments have begun to explore financing additional expenditures without raising taxes while also not increasing public debt outstanding. One possibility is using proceeds from valuation gains on gold reserves, as has been floated in the US and Belgium recently. Now, for the US, this would involve revaluing the government's 261.5 million troy ounces in gold reserves, the largest gold reserves globally, from a statutory price of $42.22 per troy ounce to current market prices, which at the time of reading this stand at around $3,400 per troy ounce. They have it at $3,300, but that just shows you how gold appreciates since this note was written. So again, the note reviews those rare cases when countries use the proceeds from valuation gains on gold and foreign exchange reserves. It does not explicitly say that the U.S. will do this, that the U.S. should do this, but it did lay it out in detail. So how 5 other countries have done it. What do you make of this? Is the Federal Reserve quietly laying the groundwork for revaluing America's gold reserves? Is it planting seeds here? Do you think a gold revaluation could happen?